Viswanathan Anand has plenty of brilliant games to his illustrious credit. However, there is one brilliant game that got away from him. Playing Sokolov in 1996, he offered an incredible queen sacrifice on move 21. It reminds me a lot of the greatest queen sacrifice of all time, Nezhmetdinov versus Chernikov. After sacrificing the queen, Anand had a tremendous bind and had an opportunity on move 28 that might have allowed him to win the game. But when he slipped just a little bit, Sokolov got back in the game and conducted a brilliant counterattack to turn the game around. The game opens as Ruy Lopez, and I'm going to skip through the theory because I don't love spending a ton of time on Ruy Lopez's theory, which is one where you're just trying to get a small edge and press for the most part. Doesn't end up being too sharp in most cases. Anand picks an interesting line, I think, where he sticks a pawn here on a5 where it cramps black, but it also means that the pawn could become weak later in the game. So after the pawn sticks itself on a5, Sokolov develops and pins, and then we're going to get knight bd2 here. In this position, I think Sokolov makes a mistake, and he plays pawn to h6. Now, his idea here is actually to trap the bishop, which is pretty interesting here. If the pawn can expand, this bishop runs out of squares. But now Anand responds with a good move, pawn to h3, asking this bishop what it wants to do, and there's not really a good answer. It doesn't have a lot of great choices. The first point here is that if the bishop goes back to e6, then bishop a4 is a nice move that hits this knight at an inconvenient moment when it's awkwardly stuck defending this pawn on e5. This leads to a nice advantage for Anand. So instead, Sokolov decides that he needs to push forward with pawn to d4 here, going for the trap of the bishop and leaving his own bishop hanging, so things get really, really sharp here. But I think it all really works out to Anand's advantage. Now, we're going to get a capture on g4 here, and then capture on e3, capture back, and knight takes g4. This is a position that if you're working on your positional evaluations, I would kind of pause, take a good look, and try to assess this position, form your own opinion of the position, and try to explain it and line it up with Anand's opinion. So I think that this position is actually quite favorable for white for a couple of reasons. We get a strong half-open f-file that we're going to be able to put a lot of pressure down, and we have an unopposed light squared bishop. We're in a position with opposite colored bishops, a light squared one for white and a dark squared one for black. When you're able to attack, these opposite colored bishops favor the attacker, and I think only Anand has attacking chances here. Now, it does seem like white's pawn structure is bad, but that's less important than the piece activity, and this knight looks pretty good because there's no white pawns that can evict it. But one good piece does not a good position make, so I think this knight can easily be countered, which leaves all of the advantages on Anand's side of the board. So, after all of these exchanges, Anand plays the move bishop d5, very nice move, putting a lot of pressure right here, and Sokolov decides to defend that knight and defend the other knight, actually. So we get a 2-for-1 knight defending deal with queen d7. Pretty nice. So after queen d7, I like an improvement, I think, over what Anand did, although obviously what Anand did is pretty great too. I like the move knight h2, which recalls a great game with Nigel Short versus Anatoly Karpov, except in that game, it was knight a2. I think it was Short versus Karpov. If I'm wrong, someone correct me. I think that's right, though. It's definitely Nigel Short. In any case, this knight is kind of the one good piece in the black position. So trading it off here leaves, I think, a position where everything that matters, the strong light squared bishop and the half-open f-file, is in favor of Anand. The one good piece that Sokolov has here is traded off, and I really, really like what Anand has going here. So I think knight h2 was probably the best decision here and a really, really instructive one. When your opponent has a strong piece, look to trade it off. So in this position, after queen d7, Anand decides on knight c4, putting pressure on e5, which also seems pretty good too. Bishop f6 now, putting the bishop on kind of a bad square, but Sokolov is hoping that this is temporary. His point here is that he's going to play this move. Not right away, because that would hang a8, but after the rook moves, if the knight can go back to e7, then this bishop gets traded off, and then everything is okay for Sokolov. Really, everything hangs on this piece for Anand. So it's an interesting situation where we're seeing a lot of strategic battle regarding the strong piece that each side has and how to trade it off. So now Anand plays knight to d2, which has a threat. You might want to pause and see if you can find it if you don't see it right away. That does threaten to capture here, which overworks the queen, and then the knight on g4 can't be defended anymore after the queen recaptures. So Sokolov has only one way to hold on to that knight because it's running out of escape squares. He plays pawn to h5 in this position. Anand plays rook f1, putting the rook on the half-open f-file, which seems pretty great. And now Sokolov plays his rook out, unpinning this knight and intending knight e7 next move. He's counting on this move to eliminate the light-squared bishop when his position is not only okay, but even better. Okay, so Anand definitely feels the pressure of the moment right here and knows he needs to strike before knight e7 gets rid of his strong bishop and liquidates his core advantage in this position. He plays rook f5 when the only way to defend this pawn on h5 is g6. Pause your videos if you're not sure what's coming and try to figure out what Anand had prepared. So the right move here, and I love this move so much, is queen takes g4. I think one of the best moves in Anand's career. With queen takes g4, Anand is giving up the queen for two minor pieces because he also gets the bishop on f6 that was defended by that knight on g4. In the resulting position, it does seem hard for Anand to win the game, but all of the trumps are on his side. He's going to have tremendous pressure down the f-file here, and meanwhile, Sokolov's pieces just don't have much scope or ability to coordinate here. I think this is a position that in normal circumstances, really only white should be able to win because he controls all of the important squares and it's so hard for black to get active. Now, the only good move in this position seems to be knight e7, challenging that bishop on d5 like we've been talking about doing. Also, the knight defends the pawn on g6, which is really important. White would definitely have taken on g6 given the opportunity. So there is a tactic here. If the bishop on d5 were traded, this would totally not work for Anand. So he needs a tactic, and he does have one. He has bishop takes f7 check. The point here is that if black captures, at the end of this line, there is a royal fork. We pick off the queen, we easily win the game. So of course, Sokolov's not going to make it so easy. After the bishop captures on f7, the king steps up to g7, and now Anand brings his other rook over and dominates on the f-file. Now, because e5 is hanging here, it seems like the only sensible move for Sokolov is queen b5, defending that, also putting some pressure here on this a5 pawn. Now, in this position, I think that Anand basically has a bind. There's not much that Sokolov can do with any of his pieces to free his game. His queen doesn't really have any good targets. Okay, she's attacking a5, but she can't win it against this knight on c4. None of white's pieces can really be challenged. This knight can't move because of g6 hanging, and the rooks don't have a good chance to get free and get scope. They also have to be careful because if the rook leaves the f-file, the bishop can step back here, and then rook f7 check becomes really, really strong. So it's not clear how Anand could break through if Sokolov just sits tight, but at the same time, Sokolov can't really break through himself here. So it might be a position that's a draw, although I'd be really interested to see like AlphaZero take on this position and try to slowly build up and break through. I really think that AlphaZero might come up with something that I'm not seeing right away, although it definitely doesn't feel like this is a forced win. So after queen to b5, Anand plays some small moves that slightly improve his position, just gradually making progress and seeing how the game is going to develop. g3, rook f2, and now Sokolov tries queen c5 in this position. He's probably eyeing some of what comes next, although I bet he missed a key move. The knight comes to b3 and attacks the queen, and probably the queen should just go back to b5 when maybe this is a fortress like we were just talking about. Maybe neither side can really make progress, although I'd rather have the white position because it feels like I'm the one in control. I'm the one who can try. So after knight b3, Sokolov tries for more. He plays queen a7, which I think misses Anand's next move, although so does Anand miss his next move. You might want to pause your video and figure out what the best move is for white. So the strong move here is rook takes a6, really a beautiful move. And the point here is that queen takes a6 runs into knight c5, which hits the queen and hits the rook, but it doesn't really matter that we're hitting the rook so much, because after queen c6, we're definitely not capturing the rook when we are going to not get enough material for the rook we just gave up on a6. We're instead actually going for knight to e6 check, when the queen must give itself up. If the king runs to the h-file, we have a beautiful mate over here. So the queen must surrender herself for the knight. And what's interesting is that this position is not actually so clear. I do think that there's winning chances for Anand, but after king takes f2, there is a sting in the tail here. Now, if the rook simply retreats to d8, which looks to be forced, and many players, including myself, probably would only consider that move, there's definitely winning chances for white. I would even say probably more winning chances for white than there are drawing chances for black. But you have a move here, pawn to b3. You leave the rook hanging, but if it's captured, then this pawn becomes a queen. And if you capture the pawn, then rook takes d3 is a much better version of the endgame that we were just looking at. Now white's pawn structure is shattered, and so even though white is doing really well in material, the g4 pawn is probably gone. The a pawn does look dangerous. I think that there's good chances for Sokolov to draw. I don't know if he gets a draw. It's definitely white who's playing for the win, but it's going to be hard to win. I go back and forth. Should white win with really good play? How much can Anand press? I don't know. In any case, this is definitely what Anand should have gone for. It's definitely better for white. So, backing up, instead of rook takes a6, the brilliant move here, Anand plays knight takes e5, and I wonder if he missed rook takes a6 or if he just thought this move was crushing, because this looks to be entirely over for a second. We're hitting a rook here, and if the rook just retreats, like say pulls back to d8, then knight takes g4. We've just won 2 pawns for white, e5 and g4, both critical pawns, and we defend this. So there's no queen takes e3, and this is just totally over. Basically, white is completely crushing. And moves like this start coming in very, very quickly. However, this is not forced, and Sokolov has a great move here, and he gets to show his brilliance in this position. Now, rook d6 is also interesting. Check out the notes if you want to see what's up with that. But Sokolov plays queen takes e3 here, leaving the rook on d7 hanging so that he can get his own counterplay, which is really, really cool. So first off, if king g2, defending g3, rook d6, and the counter pressure here over stresses the white position. White's pieces are stuck defending too much. This breaks the white attack, and suddenly it is white who is in trouble and can't really hold it together as black starts invading on the h-file. So instead, Anand does take the rook that Sokolov is sacrificing here on d7. Knight takes d7. And Sokolov plays rook to h8. I kind of love this move. Anand is dominating the f-file, just all over this f-file, but Sokolov just switches over to the h-file and is like, what are you doing on the f-file? You have 2 rooks on it, a bishop. I mean, you're controlling everything on the f-file, but you can't get to my king on g7. This proves to be key, and I think at this point, Sokolov is just winning because the play on the h-file is so strong, which is kind of insane, but it seems to be true. After rook h8, I want to point out first what happens if the knight just steps back. This just allows a forced mate. There's queen e1 check, and the queen is trying to get to h1 with mate, and if the rook blocks, we just have queen takes g3. So that was mate in 2 no matter what white did. And then after king g2 instead, here not defending g3 in this position instead of trying to pull the knight back, we have rook h3 going after g3. And in this position, if the king tries to get away, this is a really important theme because of course the king wants to be running for it. We have rook check, king up, and queen h6, a nice double back, and that is mate. Unfortunately for Anand, that will end the game. So after rook h3, honing in here, Anand decides to give a piece back with bishop takes g6. Now the knight captures on g6, and Anand tries king back to f1 in this position. So at this point, he's getting some counterplay by giving up the bishop on g6. He's got some ideas of rook f7 that can save him in certain positions. For example, if Sokolov tries to focus in the same way, his checks are sufficient counterplay. So at this point, rook takes g3, intending simply to go back with rook h3, and then here, and then queen h3 mate was a decisive finish. Instead, after king f1, Sokolov played rook h1 check, and then king up to g2, and rook to d1. And this, unfortunately, isn't quite enough to finish the game. Now, this is still strong, but it does miss that idea of taking on g3 and then going back to h3, and that was completely over. That was a definite win for Sokolov. After rook d1, the game is still quite complicated, although it is Sokolov that's pressing. Rook d1 intends the queen to come in here with a tremendous attack. It also has a second idea that's really important. If, for example, knight e5 in this position, although actually knight takes e5 hangs the knight, but let's say we make some other move that doesn't hang the knight, just to pick something. Let's say knight to b8. All right, just to go somewhere, we illustrate the idea knight h4 check when pawn takes queen h3 as mate, and if the king goes here, then this knight check is going to end the game. So that's pretty cool. The knight h4 check is a crushing idea. Anand finds his best resource though. After rook d1, we have rook takes g6, and his knight fork allows him to pick off this pawn on g4. Picking off the pawn on g4 really does seem to create a fortress right here, although it's really close. Is white in possession of a fortress or not? The queen is facing off against the two knights and a lot of white pawns, but it's definitely a position where black is pressing. I think that this is probably more likely to be a draw, but in the game it proves to be quite tricky. Sokolov plays queen to e1, and now the king needs to run, of course, because queen h1 is a threatened mate. Anand picks king f3, and I think that this is a mistake because of what we're going to see. Instead, I think king h3, pointed out by Stockfish, and very unintuitive to me. I really think it's hard to consider going to the h file here and kind of separating your king on the edge of the board like this. But the point, I think, is mainly that you're going to get a chance to block with the knight, and the knight is a tremendous defender against queen checks. So I don't know how Sokolov can break through this position. It still looks better for black. White is just hanging on, but I don't know if you get through. Whereas after king f3, it does seem that Sokolov is getting there nearly by force. So queen h1 check, and then after king f4, which seems very sensible to stay defending everything, Sokolov plays to trade off the rook. I think when he trades off the rook, there's not going to be a way for Anand to defend the queenside pawns, and once the queenside pawns go, everything is destabilized and there's just not enough counterplay, and there's definitely no more fortress. That's basically the way that the game continues. Sokolov presses on g3, finally goes for the exchange, and then goes after the b2 pawn, which he wins. Now, in this position, Anand's trying to get some counterplay, but the knight and pawns just don't create a real threat of promotion. Meanwhile, when a5 goes, the black pawns are definitely queening and fast. that a pawn is a marcher. And so in this position, as the a pawn starts marching down the board and Anand realizes he's not going to force a pawn through here against the black king and also against checks from the black queen, he does decide to surrender the game. So that was such a close game for Anand. I really think it's a brilliant game on both sides. Both sides played brilliant moves at multiple points in this game, but it feels like a game that got away from Anand. He was so close to finishing off one of the best queen sacrifices in his career, and it just wasn't quite there, and Sokolov turned it all around. But in any case, it's a great game, and I hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, please do like and subscribe and hit the bell to be notified of future videos. And also check out the playlist with more amazing games from Anand that he did finish off with a victory.